Hello again. I'm Dr. Tim Cooper, doing the second of three presentations on climate change. The first presentation was specializing in the science, and we learned essentially, the real summarize of it, is that we're putting carbon dioxide into the air through burning fossil fuels, and it's heating up the planet, and it's a big problem. If we let it go too far, feedbacks will kick in and accelerate the temperature increase still further, so that we have to try to avoid reaching that point. So the first one was my comfortable spot. That was the science. I'm a scientist after all. Now today I want to talk a little bit about politics and economics. In the third of the series, we'll talk about technology, what we can do to fix the situation, and that's like the good news. But the politics and the economics contains what I would consider the bad news. So without further ado, let's move on. I'm going to speak most about politics at the beginning, and if all the young people in the world, the very young ones, had the vote, I think we wouldn't have an issue. The problem comes about because nobody really seems to be speaking for them. And politics is, as I hope to convince you, the problem here with climate change. The future temperature is determined by politicians. That's a strange thought, but it is so. From a scientific perspective, each country in the world has a science council, which is supposed to advise the government. And they do, and they sometimes get listened to and sometimes get ignored. But they all agree on three main points. The planet is warming, we are causing it, and it's very, very dangerous. Okay? By contrast, let's see how the politicians hear that. Well, a famous politician said, "Climate change is a hoax invented by the Chinese to ruin our economy." Do you know who said that? Well, this is a TV show, so I can't wait for an answer. But yes, you probably already know, that was Donald Trump. Here's another one for you. Who said lowering our carbon emissions would kneecap the economy? And the answer to that one was the Right Honourable Stephen Harper, and indeed every member of his cabinet. They were all instructed to use the word kneecap to give a consistent message. So politicians do not seem to be in line with the scientists. In Canada, what do the politicians really do? Well, obviously they can direct money, and according to a study by the International Monetary Fund, Canada subsidizes fossil fuels, that's coal, oil, and natural gas, to the tune of $40 billion a year. That's 40 billion US dollars. If you like to break that down into something that's easy to understand, for every man, woman, and child in Canada, we have to pay in tax $1,650 every year to subsidize fossil fuels. The fossil fuel company can take that money that minimizes their expenses and allows them to sell fossil fuels back to us at a lower price so that we're less likely to look for alternatives. That's the system that we have going in Canada and in many other countries worldwide. Canada, as I hope to convince you today, is actually one of the worst in the world. Many other countries are doing a lot better than us. Well, with all that money, if you try to track it, it's very hard. That's why I rely upon the International Monetary Fund. They're economists, I'm not. I'll just let them do the work. But I'll give you an example of the sort of thing that sometimes is harder to quantify, but you can actually see it. In Canada, 7,000 people are killed every year by burning fossil fuels, wrecking the air quality, and then having small particles, often PM 2.5s, breathed in, and that causes problems for heart, lung, and eventually death. So if in Canada 7,000 people die every year, here in Chilliwack, we have a small fraction of the population, about 20 people are killed every year. That has an expense. If 20 are killed, you can bet that something like 200 are injured. And the effect on the economy is quite significant of all these lost people. Worldwide, it's about 7 million. So that's quite a lot. That's just air quality. Air quality, that's not the sort of problem that we've been talking about so far, which is fossil fuels. So here I have a slide coming up. The different countries of the world have been ranked by an organization called Climate Action Network Europe. Yes, it's an environmental group. And they have looked at the different countries of the world and ranked them from best to worst. This table doesn't include every country in the world, but you can see the one that's the worst is the one that I'm currently sitting on, and so are you most likely. Canada. We're number 1. Now, I always feel a little bit of shame in that as a Canadian, but on the other hand, there's hope too, because if we are the worst in the world, we have the most easy time improving. We just simply have to emulate what other people are doing, and we can get a big improvement. But what are we doing? There's a whole bunch of things just to illustrate it. Here I have a picture of the world's top climate scientist, James Hansen. He was with NASA. He was NASA's top climate physicist. He actually decided to quit and go full-time into lobbying for the climate and attending protests against the government, which he couldn't do when he was in his role with NASA. One of the quotes that he is famous for, he says, if the tar sands, and in Canada that means Alberta, if the tar sands are fully developed, it's going to cause a 40% increase in the carbon dioxide content of the Earth's atmosphere. And that will be, and I quote, game over for the climate. So are we doing anything to stop the climate change from getting out of control? Are we stopping the tar sands of Alberta? And actually, yes, I know, there isn't any tar in the tar sands, but there's no oil there, so we can't call them oil sands either. Technically speaking, as a scientist, it's bitumen. But anyway, we are currently spending, that is the federal government, almost $20 billion on a pipeline for the industry so that they can get their product to market. So that actually makes it much easier for them to sell their wares. So the federal government is definitely not heading in the direction of reducing carbon dioxide emissions, which is unfortunate. Provincially, here in BC, we get our natural gas from fracking. And in my first presentation, we talked about how fracking, when you crack the rocks, methane escapes from the rocks into the air, and methane immediately starts trapping per pound 120 times as much as carbon dioxide would trap per pound, trapping heat, that is to say. So when you're fracking, the natural gas you get, plus the natural gas that escapes, gives rise to about 1.6 times more warming than if we just burnt coal. So if methane is coming from fracking, it would be kind of better to burn coal in coal-fired power plants rather than the methane. That's not good. Here in BC as well, our provincial government does have other subsidies for the gas and oil industry to the tune of about $1 billion a year. That's quite a lot of money. Okay. Well, that sounds as if we're really missing out on things, we're really getting things wrong. I'd like to show you this transparency, which is looking at the world's top 10 greenhouse gas emitters, and Canada is in the top 10. And we take the top 10 and we rank them on emissions per person, or emissions per capita. You can see right at the top, we're number 1. Lucky us. So yes, when people like to tell you that Canada is not part of the problem, we're so small, look at China, look at somewhere else. No, on a per person basis, we're number 1. Besides, it is so obviously unfair to compare a country of 1.4 billion to a country of 38 million, or whatever Canada's population is now. So on a per capita basis, it's the only one that makes sense. We're number 1. Well, if I now show you this graph, which is how Canadian emissions have gone since 1990, and you'll have to excuse me, I keep looking over there, just my little prompter over there, I've got a little teleprompter. Since 1990, various countries have been aware of climate change, and you can see something like United Kingdom has almost halved its emissions, almost halved. Canada, and that's the bottom line, the top line, the green line, Canada, has increased them by 20%, even though politician after politician has said we need to cut back. So what they say, what they do, not in synchronization. My mother taught me when I was a young child, if you want to know what a person's thinking, don't listen to what they say, look at what they do. It's a better guide. Well, here's another graphic, which I'm going to come back to in my third presentation, which is the carbon dioxide emissions per person as a function of time. Okay, and it doesn't go until the most recent ones, but you can see that Canada and the United States, and this is just purely carbon dioxide emissions, doesn't count that methane. Canada and the United States are significantly above the rest of the world, and we are about a factor of 3 times higher than Europe on a per person basis. Or actually, rather, a factor of 3 more times the world and a factor of 2.5 times Europe. I'm going to come back and do that comparison. The little figure to the right of it, that graph, is just giving a breakdown of where Canada's emissions go, which industries. And I'm going to come back to that again in part 3 and talk about that. What is it the scientists are saying has to be done? Well, if the planet warms 2 degrees Celsius or more, then there's a 1 in 3 chance that the feedbacks that I mentioned, such as the melting ice and the decaying tundra, will happen. And we will therefore end up with somewhat of a runaway effect in the climate, which we definitely don't want. So if we can keep the temperature to 1.3 degrees Celsius, 1.5 degrees Celsius, then that likelihood is very small. Now, we've already raised the temperature 1.1 degrees Celsius, so to go to 1.5, there's not much wiggle room left, if you see what I mean. And that means we're near the end of the amount of carbon dioxide we can emit. So if we do want to go as far as 2 degrees Celsius, and certainly the Harper government did say that was their goal, then there is a 1 in 3 chance that the climate will run away. That's 33% chance of something really bad happening. Perhaps it would be better to give your child a revolver with 1 bullet and 5 empty chambers. The game is called Russian roulette. The likelihood of something bad happening is only 16.5% instead of 33%. Well, that's a bit dramatic, perhaps, but you can see why a lot of us in science are worried. So what we need to do is to look how much more we can emit, subject to the temperature not going above 1.5 degrees Celsius. Well, when you put carbon dioxide into the Earth's atmosphere, it stays there a long time. Technically, I'd have to say that half of it is still there 2,000 years later. So it's got a huge lifetime. Methane, if you remember, was much shorter, like about 12 years. So if it's there for 2,000 years, whether we emitted it yesterday, the day before, or 2 weeks ago, it really doesn't matter. What matters is the total amount of carbon dioxide that's been emitted in the past, and that determines the temperature and the rate of increase of temperature today. So how much can we emit and be consistent with 1.5 degrees Celsius? Well, that's what the IPCC tells us. The IPCC tells us we can emit 420 gigatons. That's 420 billion, or 10 to the power 9, tons of carbon dioxide. And that's it. So 420 gigatons, that's a number that to you, I imagine, is totally meaningless. It would be to me in this context as well. So what does that mean? Well, that figure was given in 2018. Since then, we've emitted 42 gigatons per year. So if we keep emitting 42 gigatons per year, it's going to take 10 years before we've emitted the whole lot that we're allowed to emit. In other words, we're going to keep doing exactly what we're going to do up until 2018, and then do a hard shutdown, a total elimination of oil, coal, and gas. Well, that's not a very good plan. And so the scientists at the IPCC said, that's not a very good plan. But what they said is, we need to start reducing right away. And by 2030, as long as we've got our emissions down by 45%, we can taper them off. We can get to 0 by 2050, comfortably that way. Have we as a planet, or certainly as a country, reduced our emissions at all since 2018? Nope, not at all. So we have a problem, okay? A big problem. But what is Canada's model duty? You know, I'm a scientist. I love numbers. When it comes to models, that's a bit more nebulous to my way of thinking. If you prefer the word ethics, we can use that too. Well, what's fair for Canada? The whole world has been emitting carbon dioxide in the past, and we have a certain amount we could all emit into the future. It seems to me that every person on Earth should be allowed to emit the same amount between now and when we have to stop. If that's so, if you buy into that a Chinese person and a Canadian person should have the right to emit the same amount of carbon dioxide, then Canada would have to reduce by a factor of 3 to get down to the world average, and because we have to cut the total by a factor of 2, we then have to drop another factor of 2. In other words, we have to drop by a factor of 6 by 2030. Technically, it's possible. Economically, it's doable. Politically, very difficult. But we'll see what happens. It all depends on how people vote. But I wanted to share that factor of 6 with you because it is kind of like my nightmare figure. Okay, that's the politics. It's very much an unhappy place. Let me talk about economics, because politicians can make the rules by which the economy runs, and the economy can be set up in such a way that it will result in the reduction of carbon dioxide. So let's talk about economics. Well, one thing that you should know is that you and I, when we heat our houses and we drive our cars, we're responsible for approximately 15% of Canada's emissions. So if some politician tells you, well, why don't you give up your car? That's not the problem. It wouldn't make a big difference. 85% of Canada's emissions are from industry. And industrial emissions can be reduced by the federal government just by a snap of the fingers. It's that easy. But how, you may ask? Well, for that we have to go into the dubious science, or the dismal science as they call it, of economics. And economics is all about encouraging people to do things. It's about setting up motivations and incentives. So the answer lies with an economist called Pigou, who came up with the concept of Pigouvian taxes. And let me explain what a Pigouvian tax system is. When a person does harm to other people, we'd like to discourage them from doing that. So you tax them, and you make it a bit less profitable for them. When a person does good for other people, we don't tax them, so we encourage them to do that good. This is the Pigouvian system of taxation. So let's look at what people are doing in Canada. Well, as a physics teacher at the university, I have the option of teaching extra courses if I want. And the university will pay me about $7,000, but the government then immediately takes away about $3,000 in physics teaching tax. They don't want physics to be taught. That's a discouragement. And if you're scratching your head saying, what the heck's he talking about? It's actually technically called income tax. You've heard of it. But look at the effect. The effect is to discourage me from working. If you have a corporation, you're hiring people, you're paying them a salary, and you're producing a product other people want. Should you be taxed? Well, you are. That's what corporate taxes are all about. So Pigou's idea would say, well, let's start taxing things we don't want, like carbon dioxide, and then lower the tax on salaries and on business. So that's essentially a carbon tax. That's how it works. I have a question for you, some quotes. Who said, the business community in Canada is solidly backing carbon pricing as a way for it to play its part in the fight against climate change? The business community is solidly backing it? That was actually the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Here in Canada, the oil industry may be worse off if their product becomes more expensive and people buy less of it, but the rest of the economy is better off. Something to think about. Well, who said a carbon tax is the worst tax ever? That's a very powerful statement, isn't it? And the answer was Doug Ford, Premier of Ontario. He said that soon after he was elected. He was fighting against the Liberal government's carbon tax, the federal Liberal government, that is. When he came to power, he cancelled 750 contracts with clean energy providers, primarily wind and solar, and had to pay $230 million for the privilege of cancelling those contracts. I can't even begin to imagine how many people were thrown out of work as a result. huge number of jobs lost. And since renewable energy is now cheaper than natural gas energy, which is what he replaced it with, that means everybody in Ontario is now going to be paying more for electricity. So that's a very ideological position that he took. Very supportive of one industry, but quite destructive to the others. Here I've got a graph about how else you could reduce carbon dioxide emissions other than using a simple carbon tax. If you look at the line on the top, which is the one with the biggest GDP, we're plotting GDP on the left versus year. If we look at a scenario where we do purely a carbon tax and then either use the money to reduce other taxes or, like the federal government currently does, rebate it to people, that gives you a fairly good growth in the GDP. The other two lines are mixtures with some carbon pricing but some regulation. And, well, I'll leave you to look at it at your leisure because you're actually watching this, you can freeze frame. You don't get the economic growth that you do with a carbon tax. It is, in fact, the best tax ever. Something to think about. And another way to think about it, if you like, is, well, how can a carbon tax help the economy? Well, let's suppose, just for the sake of argument, that a carbon tax was put on, natural gas became expensive. How many of you in your homes would say, well, maybe we should stop heating with natural gas. Let's pay a guy to come and insulate our roof. Let's pay a guy to install a heat pump. You can see that stimulates the economy, makes money go around. So it's something to think about. But here's another question, ones that politicians also like to duck. How big should the carbon tax be? Well, I mentioned that Europeans emit roughly a third as much as Canadians, or 1/2.5. How do they do it? They have a similar lifestyle to us. Not exactly the same, but they're quite comfortable, they're quite happy, and yet they emit roughly a third. Well, when you look at the price of gasoline, they are paying over $2 a litre. We're paying about $1.40. We have very cheap gasoline. How big would the carbon tax have to be then for us to emulate Europe so that we're paying $2 a litre and therefore being discouraged from driving unnecessarily or driving unnecessarily inefficient vehicles? And you can do the math. It works out to be about $300 a litre for carbon dioxide. $300 a tonne. The current federal amount is $40 a tonne. So we're about a factor of 10 too low. And that is why when the opposition MPs say to the Liberal government, your carbon tax isn't working, they're not entirely wrong. It's not working because it hasn't been high enough to motivate people to change. Another way of asking the question, how high should a carbon tax be, is, well, how much would it cost to undo the damage? There are many schemes involving carbon capture and storage. How expensive is it per tonne of carbon dioxide to capture that? And the answer is that, well, I haven't seen one that's less than $300 a tonne by much yet. There's a lot of talk, a lot of hype. The oil industry loves the concept because it means they can keep polluting. But it's all hype as far as I can see. Nobody has yet come under $300 a tonne. So another good reason why your carbon tax should be $300 a tonne. But wait, there was silence when 750 contracts were cancelled in Ontario despite the massive number of jobs. But if somebody cancels a fossil fuel job, oh, the noise, the job loss, it's awful. But how many people really do work for the oil industry, and compared to what? Well, here's some numbers. In 2017, according to Clean Energy Canada, there was almost 300,000 people working in clean energy. That includes wind energy, solar energy, hydro energy, that includes house retrofitting, etc. In fact, that industry in 2020 added $35,000 new jobs, just like that. That was even with COVID going on, which is quite impressive. Meanwhile, how many does the oil and gas industry actually employ? About 162,000. So clean energy is already employing double the number of people that the fossil fuel industry employs. We just don't hear so much from them, but they're there. In fact, North America-wide, the biggest handicap for the expansion of wind and solar energy is finding qualified people to work there. It's a shortage of labor. That's a nice problem to have, but we do have this problem. Shortage of labour, we need somehow to convince people to train up for the new jobs. Well, some politicians will tell you, we don't need a carbon tax, we'll get out of this using innovation. Well, how do you get innovation? With the carbon tax, you raise the cost of using carbon and you motivate people to find ways to emit less carbon, because that way it saves them energy and therefore saves them money. Actually, energy use is okay, I shouldn't have said that, but if you tax carbon, people will do what they can to avoid emitting the carbon and therefore paying the tax. In other words, to take an old-fashioned phrase, necessity has been created to find another way, and necessity is the mother of invention. I mentioned wind and solar were now cheaper than any other form of energy, and I'll talk more about that in my third presentation. But how did it get that way? It was a genius called Angela Merkel, a physicist no less, or physical chemist if you prefer, quantum chemist technically, who foresaw that if she starts buying a lot of wind and solar energy in Germany, which was very expensive at the time, the industry will develop, mass production will kick in, the price will come down. That's exactly what happened. She didn't quite finish the job, China finished it for her, but it has taken us to this happy place. Okay. So let me summarize this module then by saying that the economists are all pretty much in agreement. The way to deal with this problem is through a carbon tax, be it tax and dividend or tax and don't do the taxes elsewhere. Politicians don't. Something is stopping politicians from taking that message forwards. The carbon tax that we do have in Canada is too small. It needs to be at least $200, $300 would be better. And the whole point about the carbon tax, it will stimulate the development of new technology. Canada is standing almost alone in not moving forwards with the change. We run the risk of having all of our industries out of date and having to buy all of our products from overseas. So we need to move, and we need to move fast. Okay, that concludes this presentation. The next presentation, I'd like to talk to you about what technology we already have existing and how to put it in place. And unlike this presentation, which is kind of gloomy, the next one is rather good. I will see you then. Bye from me.